Hello again and thanks for joining. Today we've got this PIKO model to have a look at. It's number 57503 and it's a German Deutsche Bahn diesel locomotive class 218. It comes from PIKO's hobby range and we're going to take a look at it today. So I did a review of another one of these class 218 locomotives. I'll put a link in the description below to that video and you can check out what that one is like in more detail. But I have it here to compare with this one. So let's get this out and compare the two and then we'll see which one's the best. So this is another model that I've picked up second hand. The box has fared not too bad so far. It's got a few bashes here on the corner and also on this end of the box. And you can see here the number of this model and also the details about the diesel locomotive. Somebody has written something on here which makes me kind of think that maybe this is DCC. I've only got a DC set up, so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to test this today, but we'll open this up and we'll have a look and see what we can do. So as I was taking out the packaging there, I did notice that the inner tray has cracked a little bit here and broken, and so therefore the model isn't being held that well in this plastic sleeve. It also has another break at this end here. Now that might have happened when it was being sent to me, but I kind of think not, because there's a bit of tape here holding the box together, and also over here there's another tear as well. So this has had a bit of a hard life and it might be indicative of how fragile the packaging is on these PIKO models as they get a bit older. Anyway, let's have a look at the model. So here we have the two models together, the PIKO one in the front and the Roco one at the back. You can already start to see some of the differences here. The obvious one is the colour scheme. I think the Roco one is brighter red because that's a more modern colour for Deutsche Bahn. The maroon here seems to be an older livery, but you can also see something straight away. For example, the PIKO locomotive has an interior whereas the Roco one doesn't. Remember on the box it said hobby, so that's PIKO's budget range. We should compare these like for like because I think the Roco one is also the budget range. So let's look at the PIKO one in more detail. So we're starting here at the front of the locomotive and you can see straight away that it's got some really nice detail. It's got this additional panel here with some what looks like lights. I'm hoping they're going to light up when we give this a test. You also see the Deutsche Bahn logo and the number 218219-4. You can also see that the windows are nice and clear with some moulded in windscreen wipers, and they've even got a surround painted in black around there as well, so that's very neat. And it gives you a good view inside the cab of this locomotive where you can see a driver there as well. So starting to look down the side here, again you can see into the driver. One of the things I've noticed here is that there's a silver surrounding around these windows, and that was missing on the Roco one. I'll just show you that. And that could be prototypical of these older locomotives having a silver surround and the modern ones perhaps don't. But it's really nice that PIKO have decided to put that in here. It's a nice bit of detail. Looking a bit further down, we've got the first door here with the handrails coming down. Now on the Roco one, this was picked out in silver and had a lot of definition. This one is not so much. I'll just show you the comparison here. Here is the Roco one. So here's the PIKO one. And as we start to look down the side of the locomotive, you can see that there's not so much relief in the grills here. And these panels here, which may be windows on the prototype, are just blanked over here. One thing that's really good on this model is the definition between the dark maroon and the dark grey here with this silver line. It's very clear and nicely applied. But if we look further down at the bottom here, just above the chassis, it does have a little bit of blurring around this footstep here. Seems to be something strange happening in this part just here. It looks maybe like the paint is not taken in that a little bit, so I'm not sure what's going on there. There's some nice transfers here. There's not a lot of decoration on this model, but there's just enough, and what is there is very nicely applied. And you can see as we head down to the other end of the locomotive, there's another door here. This is similar to the Roco one. You can see it here where it's got two handles on the Roco one, and that's also represented here on the PIKO one, but I think the moulding isn't quite so good around here. And finally down number 2 end, there's no driver in here, but it does have an interior, or at least an indication of an interior. This silver part on each end looks as though it's an additional part that's been added in. There isn't really much detail on the buffer beam here. So as we look further down at the bogies, I did notice that there's a lot more detail on the Roco one rather than this PIKO one. The moulding is okay, but it doesn't have a lot of deep relief. And I've also noticed that it doesn't have the steps coming down on each corner. It's a fairly simple affair for the underneath of the bogies here, and you have these couplings sitting on the model. There is a bit of movement in these couplings, but not much. But with this model, you do get NEM pockets, which you don't on the Roco one. In the middle of the locomotive, there's a representation of what I think is possibly an air tank and then the fuel tank, and again another bogie at this end, which is very similar, which is identical to the first one. And it seems on this model, as with the Roco one, all wheels are driven, and I guess all wheels pick up. There's no traction tyres on any of these. This locomotive doesn't have a lot of things going on the roof, so what it does have in real life has been represented here quite simply. There's a couple of panels, some grills, and some exhaust pipes here as well. But I do think that the Roco one has better detail on the roof. It's just molded a bit clearer, and you'll see that it has rivet detail on these panels, which the PIKO one does not. It also has this exhaust pipe here, which I've noticed has been applied, and also this part here, which isn't on the PIKO one, but that might actually be prototypical. But you can see that some of the dimensions are different between the two, so it's arguable about who got the dimensions correct between PIKO and Roco. So doing a like-for-like comparison at the front, you can see that they're very, very similar. I'd probably say the one on the left, the PIKO one, is a little bit more detailed above the buffer beam, but the Roco one is better with some details below the buffer beam. But you can see that there is quite a difference between the width of these two locomotives. The red one is definitely wider than the dark maroon one. So again, I'm not sure which one is more prototypical, but I would assume that maybe the Roco one is. Now that I've got the two locomotives side by side here, you can see that there's some key differences in the moulding, and that's most highlighted around the door. The more modern Roco one is much better defined and has this ladder coming down, but I do like this window surrounds and the fact that it's got an interior and a driver on the PIKO one. So let's get the PIKO one open. If you want to see the Roco one, what it's like inside, then have a look at the other video and you can see that in detail. But let's have a look at the PIKO one. So just looking on the underside of the model, there seems to be a screw just here underneath the fuel tank. So I'm going to start by taking that off and see how we get on. Okay, we've got the locomotive apart now, and that was quite easy to do. And now I realise that what I was seeing there with this line here was actually a split between the body and the chassis. So we'll have a look at the chassis in a moment, but the body seems to be quite a nice moulding overall. It does have some extra pieces added on, and one of the surprising parts is actually the roof is a separate piece. You can see here where it's been bonded to the main body. This is a nice detail here where the driver compartment has been sectioned off from the rest of the body, and I can see that there is some little clear plastic going up there, and also this part here for the lighting at the front, and they've done that quite nicely because that means I think that there won't be any light leakage into the cab. But it does look as though both lights will come on at the same time, but we'll give that a little look when we give it a test. Aside from that, there's no other parts on the inside of the body, so we'll put this aside and we'll have a look at the chassis. So I mentioned about the split going down the side here, and you can see it here. It's a very strange thing that they've done here, and they put some paint on the chassis, and that's obviously caused a problem here. I didn't notice it on any of the other corners, but that is a bit of a strange decision that's been made there. You can see at the front there's a tiny little bulb there with some wiring going back to the motor area, but what I am seeing here is what looks like a homemade, or at least I hope it is a homemade addition of a DCC chip here, because if this came from the factory like this with the chip just flailing around, I think that would be quite poor. So just looking underneath this tape, there's a maze of little wires added in here and a bit of sellotape as well. So I'm actually thinking this has probably been botched together somehow in the past. So I'm not sure whether we're going to get this to run today. I'll give it a go and see what happens. So we've got the chassis here on a piece of test track, and I've just wired up my H&M controller to this piece of track to see if it'll work. Now this might be the shortest test drive in history as I burn out this chip, but let's give it a go and see what happens. I'm quite surprised that actually ran under DC power, so that was pretty good. I'm going to put the body back on and we'll give it another little run. So there's only one screw that holds this together, and you can see the little post here that the screw goes into, so you have to line that up with the chassis when you're putting this back together. Okay, back on the test track. So overall this model runs not too bad. Its slow speed isn't great, but once it gets going it's pretty good. I'm not able to test this on DCC, and maybe that's why the previous owner fitted DCC to this, because it would improve the performance. But as it stands as a DC model, it's not too bad. I've seen worse, but it's okay. What I did notice when we had this apart was that the chassis was all made of metal, and everything below the maroon is made of metal, so it's quite heavy. So let's put this on the scales and see how much it weighs. So this model weighs 476 grams. So this model from PIKO has been quite an interesting thing to have a look at, and it's been also really good to compare it to the Roco one on a like-for-like basis to see which one's the best. Some of the things I like about this model is that it has an interior with the driver, and it also has some really nice details like the window surrounds, the windscreen wipers and the lighting bar at the front. But where it's being let down a little bit is the moulding detail on the main body part, especially around the doors. The vents as well are not very good. The printing of the logos on this is very clear and precise, and this model is very substantial. It's quite heavy, so it can pull a lot of wagons behind it, but I don't think it's very good for things like shunting because its slow speed isn't very good. It's possibly geared a little high. There's some clear differences between this and the Roco one. If you have a look at the video I made about the Roco one, you'll see my verdict on it. So comparing it to this one, there are some things I prefer on it and some things I prefer on the PIKO one. Overall though, I think possibly the Roco one, because I suspect it's a little bit of a newer model, or maybe it's been refreshed at some point. It does seem to be a better model. Certainly its slower speed is a lot better than the PIKO one, but I think somewhere in between these two models, or maybe the best of both, would be the best option if you wanted to have one of these Class 218 models. That said, both of these models would be great workhorses for your model railway layout, especially hauling a train of wagons around. I think it would look really great. It is a humble diesel locomotive. It just goes about its business every day in real life, and I think this model here could do exactly the same and probably be quite reliable as well. So I hope you enjoyed this video and my analysis of this model and the comparison with the Roco one. If you did, please give this a thumbs up, and you can subscribe to enjoy more videos like this. Don't forget to let me know what you thought of this video in the comments below. In the meantime, I'll put the PIKO one on the turntable, but that's it for today. See you next time.